Welcome everybody. The community energy sector is a very friendly and welcome space. So the aim of supporting these events was to help and get Community Energy South to share their expertise and knowledge and support groups across the north. But as I was saying, wherever you are welcome today, because we can all share our expertise and knowledge with each other to help communities wherever you're based to develop your projects, because we're all working towards the same aim, which is to deliver net zero and all the additional benefits that energy and community energy projects can deliver in local areas. So the previous events that we've delivered have been on business models, feasibility studies, case studies about what communities are already doing, how to get your town or village to net zero, so examples, and all of the previous events have been recorded and are available on the Community Energy South YouTube channel, and we can share that link. This morning we're talking about funding, so two ways that you could potentially support projects that you want to deliver: the Shared Prosperity Fund and Community Energy Bonds, and we've got a great lineup of speakers to talk to you about their personal experience. So Will from Brighton Energy Co-op will talk about the bond that they're going to issue. Carl from Abundance is going to talk about what community energy bonds are and how you can organise them. And Neil's here from the Department of Net Zero to talk about the Shared Prosperity Fund. And before I hand over to the speakers, I just want to reiterate what Liz says. This is there's no stupid question. We all slip into acronyms by mistake. Please call us out if we do that. If you think you've misheard something or not understood something, then ask a question. You will not be the only person that that won't have understood that particular point. We've all come from a range of different backgrounds and we're all here to help and support each other. So yes, I'm looking forward to a great morning. Thank you for attending, and I shall hand over to Neil, who is our first speaker. So thank you very much, Neil.
So good morning. I hope you can all hear me. Apologies as usual, when I'm presenting, I'm going to have to switch to my notes for this, though you'll be glad to hear there isn't a presentation. So you're just going to have pictures of me talking to you for this morning. So yes, my name is Neil Whitney. I work in the local net zero team in the Department for Net Zero. We've just been renamed from BEIS, which was Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, to the new Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And I'm here today to talk about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. That's an economic growth fund. It's operated by another department, which is the Department for Levelling Up Houses and Communities. But I should just be talking about the net zero parts of it. So what is the fund? Well, it's the replacement funding for what were called European structural funds, which were the development funds or the economic growth funds that were in place when we were part of the European Union. But the new funding, the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, is seeking to improve upon what used to happen under the European structural funding by reducing levels of bureaucracy and administration and giving a lot more freedom to local areas to choose the actions most relevant to them. It's 2.6 billion pounds of new funding for local investment by March 2025, and the UK Shared Prosperity Fund is mainly revenue funding, so that's people and softer things rather than capital funding, but it does have a little bit of capital for infrastructure. That's in contrast with another fund which is operated by the Department for Levelling Up, which is the Levelling Up Fund, and that provides capital funding for infrastructure with a tiny bit of revenue. So I'm going to call it the UK SPF rather than the UK Shared Prosperity Fund all the time, but hopefully that should be not an acronym too far. Anyway, the UK SPF was set up to support the government's commitment to levelling up all parts of the country, and in particular it's meant to be delivering these levelling up objectives. And the first one is around boosting productivity, pay and living standards, and the second one was to spread opportunities and improve public services. The third one was to restore a sense of community and pride and local belonging, particularly where they've been lost. And then finally, to empower local leaders and communities. And the way that Levelling Up White Paper did that was to set out several missions. And in particular, the Shared Prosperity Fund is about delivering one of those missions, which is by 2030, pride in place, such as people's satisfaction with their town centres and engagement with community, will have risen in every part of the UK, with the gap between the top performers and other areas closing up. So how did it work? How does it work? So rather than having to compete all local places were allocated funding. And in order to get their allocated funding, they were asked to set out the measurable outcomes they wanted, which reflected the local needs and opportunities. And then they linked what they were trying to achieve to a set of interventions that they wanted to deliver. And then places chose the interventions across 3 sets of priorities for communities, local business and peoples and skills. And they set those out in the investment plan, which went to the UK government for approval in August last year. And within those very broad aims of community, business and skills, effectively, each place had the flexibility to choose in their investment plans what range of activities they wanted to support to reflect the local need again. So it's not the case for this funding that every local authority will be funding the same things. And this is a key shift from what happened under the EU. This is a more flexible approach where the local authorities chose what they thought were local priorities for investment. Now, when it's coming on now to the net zero bit, which is where we got involved, when the UK Shared Prosperity Fund was first set up, they started something called heads of terms, which is just a description of what you're wanting to get from the funding. And within that heads of terms, we as a department made sure it had a clean growth or net zero principle in both its heads and terms and its prospectus. So one of the overall goals for the fund is that investments which are made under the funding should demonstrate the extent of contribution to net zero and nature recovery objectives, including the UK's legal commitment to cut greenhouse gas emissions to net 30 by 2050. That's our carbon budgets and our 2050 target, which is written into law, but also wider environmental considerations, such as resilience to natural hazards. So that, if you're interested in that side, includes climate change adaptation, and the commitments that's made in the 25-year environment plan, and any similar commitments that are made in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, because this is a UK fund. So one of the things we also did was I've talked about how you have these investment plans, and there's like a list of indicative interventions underneath it, which councils could draw upon. What we tried to do is, when they were coming up with that list of interventions, put in place ones that would be relevant to communities and energy. So the relevant ones for the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, the UK SPF, are, and I'm afraid I'm going to mention numbers here. It's going to sound a bit like battleships. I apologise. Number E2, which is funding for new or improvements to existing community and neighbourhood infrastructure projects, such as those that increase communities' resilience to natural hazards, such as flooding. And this can cover both capital spend and running costs. E11, which is investment in capacity building and infrastructure support for local community groups. E13, community measures to reduce the cost of living through measures to improve energy efficiency, combat fuel poverty and climate change. And E14, funding for relevant feasibility studies. At this point I should really say bingo or something, but those are probably the most relevant set of the interventions that were mentioned in the prospectus. But in addition to that, a little bit later, another department, this one's DEFRA, and that's Department for Environment and Rural Affairs, Food and Rural Affairs, I think it's got anything there as well. And they set up something called the Rural England Prosperity Fund, which they agreed with DLUC would also be delivered through this same mechanism of as the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, but it's additional and complementary. And so the Rural Fund is effectively a top-up to the UK SPF, available to all eligible local authorities in England, and it succeeds what was called under the EU leader funding, so funding for rural development, and part of the Rural Development Programme for England. So explicitly in the rural funding, there was capital funding for new and improved community infrastructure to provide essential communal services and assets for local people and businesses to benefit the local economy. And again, just like the rest of the UK SPF, it has the same net zero principle about helping to deliver our 2050 net zero target and helping climate resilience, and it works in a similar way to the UK SPF, just a slightly different timescale. And again, there's a list of interventions underneath it. And this one's interesting because it's explicitly linked to that E11, the E11 I'll go back to it so that you don't have to remember it, was investment in capacity building and infrastructure support for community groups. That E11 explicitly said capital grants for the provision of net zero infrastructure for rural communities and support rural tourism activity, for example, EV charging points and community biomass, heat pumps and solar. And it's different. This is the reason this is different. The rural prosperity fund is different is because it's primarily a capital fund. So it's funding for infrastructure. So there's a bit of revenue, but it's mainly capital. So all those prospectuses, as they were called, went out to local authorities. Oh gosh, I'm going to say spring last year, and most of the plans were put in. I'm going to say August last year, though I think there was a bit of a slippage, and most of them have now been approved. And the funding's been drawn down. What that means is that you've got an investment plan, but then councils can draw up their own programs in line with their investment plans to deliver what they want to do for the local plans. So what you're seeing now, and I'm as dependent here on Google as the rest of you are, is the local programs that deliver those investment plans. Now, at the moment, we can see some of them for some local authorities because they've been published. Most of the ones, and then what happens is that the media, etc., are told about the investment plans and what the priorities are in that local area. The plans for the rural fund, they are likely to start in April, so there aren't so many announcements yet about what the grant schemes are for those use that rural funding, but we can start to see, if we, which is just, I'm afraid, scrolling the media, that some councils have included community energy in their planning. So, for example, in Grimsby, we can see that UK SPF is funding Smarter Energy North East Lincolnshire, for which the lead partners are eFactor and Grimsby Community Energy, and that aims to provide a programme of business support and information for energy efficiency measures. And there should also be a grant scheme to support investment in carbon saving initiatives to eligible enterprises, and I think that will receive about £200,000 worth of funding. And then both South Hams and West Devon district councils have got their £1 million of UK SPF, and again they'll be looking at targeted business and community support programmes. And again, in their press release, the council said they'll be offering business decarbonisation support and consultancy, which will include support for community energy groups to help them bring projects forward and to access funds to support their goals. And then Hereford councils, their investment plan prioritises revenue support for carbon audits, complemented by the Rural England Prosperity capital grants to help farm businesses consider using lower grade lands for energy generation directly by them or by community owned energy projects. Just a couple more. West Norfolk Borough Council funding. They're still waiting for their rural fund, but they anticipate that they will open applications in spring, and they will use that for capacity building and infrastructure support for local civil society and community groups. And they're continuing to support community energy savings scheme through shared prosperity funding. And then Cornwall announced on Valentine's Day 3 new funding categories under their use of the Shared Prosperity Fund, including one on strategies to mitigate the cost of living for community programs to improve energy efficiency and to create or improve local green and blue spaces. So, strengths and weaknesses of this approach. It's really going to vary now from one local area to another, what those priorities are and how they're using that funding for the UK SPF. But if the local authority has decided in this area that tackling climate change is important to them and it is a priority, there is scope within their investment plans for them to come forward with schemes to do that where they've chosen to do so. So in terms of next steps, it may just be a case of contacting your council to see how they're using their UK SPF monies. Not all of them will be promoting energy efficiency, but in particular for rural councils where this successor to LEADER is in place for the Rural Prosperity Fund, there's explicit support for community energy. I'll end it there. I'm not sure if we're doing questions now or questions later.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Well, we were going to do, normally we do questions later, but I feel that what you're talking about is quite different from abundance. And I suspect there may be some questions coming up already. So for example, Danny Lee.
Sure, okay, thank you very much. Neil, thank you for that. Yes, I'm aware that Winchester's probably got about £1 million. Yes, they've talked about the UK Social Prosperity Fund is in the mix, but it's complete silence. And I'm pushing, but I'm wondering whether there is any oversight that your department has on how this is going to be spent, and whether my blank wall that I'm hitting can be unlocked with your assistance, please.
Okay, well, I'll do the formal response first, and then I'll do the informal response afterwards. So the formal response is that there is a process for monitoring and evaluating what's happening to the fund at high level, and we are involved in that monitoring and evaluation process. But what that means is that because they want it to be light touch and also to allow flexibility to local authorities, is that once the money's been spent or it's going out the door, we will see how much of that money went to things that helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's what I'm wondering. So we are keeping an overview on what the fund's achieving. I think a lot of local authorities have only just had their allocations, if you like. So they've got this investment plan which says broadly what they want to do, but it may be that in each of their places they want to set up a separate scheme to deliver that through either competition or allocation locally. And that means that they may not have got around to developing in that scheme, and they don't want to tell you about it before everyone's had a chance to get to it. And I'm being as constructive as I can to the local authority position here. If you drop me an email, so I'm neil.whitney@beis.gov.uk, an email afterwards, I can pursue locally. I can chase that kind of thing up. We tend to work through something called the local net zero hubs, which have already been mentioned by Helen, and I would work with our local authority contacts on that hub to chase up where you're having problems working out what they're using the fund for.
Okay, thanks, Neil. That's very helpful.
No problem.
Okay, we've got a question from Maria, then from Daniel Heary, then from Phil Sandel.
Hi, Neil. Mine's quite straightforward, I think. Has every local authority received funding, and is there a list of how much they've received?
Yes, and yes. The full list, I'm not going to give you the full list, but it's on the gov.uk website. I think most areas received funding, but the amount was variable depending on what they saw as the levelling up need, I think is the short answer.
Thank you. Right, Daniel, Daniel, your question, please.
Yeah, just the mechanics of accessing the funding, really. Do the councils have to go out and do a procurement, or would we just send a proposal in asking for the money, or in some cases would the councils just allocate the money to one of their own projects?
So really boringly, this really varies. So we're monitoring, because this is quite interesting to me to see how they do it. It varies now from local authority to local authority. In some cases, they'd already identified projects they were going to fund, and they put details of those in their investment plan. In lots of cases, what they said is we'll run a program and we'll invite bids into that program. So it really is a case of working it out authority by authority.
Okay, thanks.
And Phil Sandel.
Hello, Neil. Thank you for that. We happen to be in the enviable position of having a multi-tiered local authority set up here in Cambridgeshire. At the top is the combined authority mayoralty of Peterborough and Cambridgeshire, then Cambridgeshire County Council, then 3 district councils, and then local councils. So it's a nightmare trying to work through all that to find out where money's going. I'm assuming, rightly or wrongly, that when you speak about local authority, you're talking about local planning authority. What would go in our instance?
Well, I'm going to have to Google it, because you've got a combined authority. It may have been that as part of the deal for the combined authority, it went to the combined authority, and the combined authority will work out apportionment after that. Right. I will need to go, it's one of those ones where I would need to go to the website and Google where it went to in each case.
Can you let me know?
On the whole, the interesting thing here is that on the whole, UK SPF went to lower tier councils.
Right.
So by default, it went to lower tier councils. It would only be as part of simplification if it went to another council. Now the problem is that then varies now by devolution deal from one local authority to another local authority, because every devolution deal is different. But for the moment, assume it's lower tier authorities.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, yep. Okay, Quentin.
Hi, yeah. In Cumbria, the lower tier authorities have got funding. For example, Allerdale and Eden, South Lakeland. In about a month's time, they're going to be subsumed into a new unitary authority. What happens when that transition happens?
I genuinely don't know. I presume it's part of the discussion when they form that unitary about how it comes together. What happens when you align all the things together is there's protracted negotiations about what each brings to the pot and how it's going to be treated. As I say, in general with this fund, assume it's going to lowest tier, not lowest tier because that would be, but lower tier local authorities in the first instance, and then everything else has to be done by local agreement. So it could be, for example, for some of the bigger CAs, so for some of the other places, the combined authority asks the local authorities if they can help coordinate for certain projects. So I know, for example, for business support, sometimes it's better to do it at that slightly larger regional level than at the lower tier level, but that's done at the moment by consent between the local authorities. We have quite a lot of messages in the chat, which I haven't necessarily been able to pick up. Liz, I don't know if we want to do that now or pick it up later.
I think I've been pulling them out for you.
Oh, good, thank you.
So I think you're all right. I just want to check if there are any more questions. If not, Laura, do you have anything? Given that you're kind of supporting lots of community energy groups.
Yeah, I just wanted to just clarify the oversight that the Levelling Up Department has over various applications and whether it's sort of scored against any sort of carbon reduction matrix or anything like that, and if you can veto based on.
No, we can't veto the investment plans themselves because they've been designed to be flexible enough. What we can do through monitoring and evaluation is assess the carbon savings that we think the spending will bring through. So the additional carbon savings as part of the formal monitoring evaluation grants. But no, we weren't in a position to veto something because we didn't think it was saving enough carbon.
There's just a further question from Pat Marsh is whether you're able to put, if you're happy to put your email in the chat. I don't know if that's something.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's my choice whether I do that or not. I will definitely do that because I'm happy to do it. Can I ask a question of you, Laura, which is awful in this thing, but you have the Pathways programme operating, I believe.
Yes, I manage one of the Pathways programmes in Hampshire.
Yeah. Do you know if there is anyone was looking for interaction between Pathways and SPF?
Yes, I know one specific council, but I might be embargoed saying who that is.
Okay, no problem. I think what that shows though is that lots of local authorities are at a very early stage in the development of how to use UK SPF. So the fact that you haven't heard anything doesn't mean it's bad news. It just means we're still between the overall vision having been developed and then actual programs being developed as well.
I could also point to Avalon Community Energy, who used, I think it was the precursor for SPF, of levelling up funds towards capital community energy through Mendip District Council. So that might be a good example for people to look to.
Well, thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Mark Handley and then from Helen Seagrave, and then I think we'll move on. And thank you so much, Neil. I think it's been really helpful to have such a comprehensive overview. It might be, some of us might be feeling like me, might be feeling a bit like, oh my God, how do you navigate your way through? But I think this is helping to clarify some of that. So Mark and then Helen. Or Helen, then Mark.
Mine wasn't a question. I was just going to recommend that everybody uses that link that gives the list of the councils that have been allocated funding. So I'm just looking at it and it's very clear. It's an alphabetical list of councils and how much funding they've been allocated. So it's an excellent first starting point. And for example, in the northwest, in Lancashire and Cumbria, it's not the county councils, it's the lower tier authorities that have or haven't been allocated funding. So places like Allerdale and Eden and Carlisle in Cumbria and West Lancashire in Lancashire. But for the rest of the country, it's all there. So start there would be my recommendation.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, well, Mark Handley's.
Sorry, the pop-up didn't come up over the chat, so I couldn't see that. I had to close chat. So basically, the question I have surrounds the problems some councils are in and on the verge of section 114 or already in it, like Croydon. I think Northamptonshire got into that problem, and how that works here, or their particular aversion to actually spending anything. Thank you.
Okay, so for councils in that position, there are arrangements in place about how the council is going to be run, if they actually declare that they're under section 114. In this case, it's funding which is for prescribed purpose as opposed to part of their statutory core duties. So you can imagine that some councils, will be focusing on their core duties, but yeah, okay, I'll do multiply in a second. But yeah, you can imagine that they'll be focused on making sure that they've got their finances in a good form. But otherwise, it is just part of the local authority's function to help deliver the plans that they say they're going to put in place.
Thank you.
Andy's question too.
On multiply, yep. So, oh gosh, this is history. This is going to be very dull and very technical for about 2 minutes, but I promise you, I'll try and keep it as easy as possible. So, under the European structural funds, it was divided into sort of 3 or 4 big pots. One was called regional development funding, and that's what we're mainly talking about today. One was agricultural funding, and that's closest to what LEADER was under that, and the rest of it is what's now environmental management. And the third pot was European Social Fund, and that was for jobs and skills. And while our colleagues in Department of Education were very happy, understood the idea that the funding now is going to a broad range of purposes, they wanted to make sure that some of it was at least focused on basic skills. So that's literacy and numeracy. So Multiply is a separate bit of the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is solely focused on skills development, basic literacy and numeracy. So it's another little carve out, if you like, out of the Shared Prosperity Fund just for that bit, which picks up on what the European Social Fund used to do. Oh, by the way, quick tip for those who find difficulty tracking all these things. I have a Google alert set up for the words community energy. So into my email box once a day, I get Google scraping the internet and picking me up any news stories on community energy and a couple of others as well. And that stops me having to sort of trawl through lots and lots of websites. So that's how I do it, if that's helpful.
Connie, my colleague Ron can tell you how to do that. I'll get to tell you in the chat box. I'll hand over now. Thank you so much, Neil. I think that was really, really helpful and really useful. I'm really glad that you were able to come along and talk about that. I can see some nods from some colleagues here. Carl, are you ready? We've got Carl from Abundance Investment, who can tell us about community bonds. He gave us a short presentation about community bonds a couple of months ago, and it was really useful, really interesting, and people wanted a more comprehensive overview, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Liz, and hello everybody. So I think just to draw a distinction between what we'll be talking about and then we'll later with the Brighton example, is that when we use the term community bonds, we're talking about community municipal bonds. So this is individuals lending money to councils for them to deliver their net zero plans, where I think Will's going to talk about it more specifically in the context of community energy and community benefit societies. So I'll try and just give a brief introduction to who we are, what a community municipal bond is, and then some examples of what we've done to date with this sort of idea. So Abundance, for those who haven't come across us, we're a regulated crowdfunding platform. What that means is we're a website which is set up to receive money from individuals and then sort of feed that across to entities that are looking to raise money. We're focused on what's called investment crowdfunding, so it's people lending money to entities and then receiving an interest rate in return. We were the first platform to get regulated to do this in the UK and I think globally. We have always been and set ourselves up to be entirely focused on funding climate projects. So now, we use the term net zero as that's come in to fashion over the last few years. We've raised 150 million for public sector and private sector net zero projects, anything from green social housing, energy generation, and tidal power and wind. And then over the last few years, we've started to build out the sort of municipal finance offer, raising money for councils. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. At the heart of Abundance is this idea of democratizing finance, so that enabling anyone to use the money they have to support the decarbonisation of the UK and in the process earn a return as an alternative to maybe putting money into the or the stock markets and bank savings accounts. So with the municipal investment, what we are sort of talking about here is using the sort of, I suppose, the innovation of crowdfunding to create a model for councils, rather than borrowing money, which they currently do indirectly via what's called the Public Works Loan Board from the international sort of debt markets, the sort of sovereign debt markets, enable councils to raise that money directly from their citizens. And we're doing that for two reasons. One, we believe local people and the public in general are a sort of essentially a more efficient source of capital, a cheaper source of capital for councils, and that's important because councils shouldn't borrow. They should always be thinking about best value for money and borrowing at the best rate, because they have obviously a duty of care for their whole community. So if they are raising money from residents, they shouldn't be doing that at a price which is higher than other sources of borrowing, because it inevitably is sort of regressive. It will be helping the wealthier in the community at the expense of the people that the council serves more broadly. So councils who look to raise money from citizens, it has to be done at a competitive rate. But what we believe is sort of exciting for councils and the councils we've worked with is that by raising money from residents, they start to build a new relationship with those citizens in their community, and that relationship, by strengthening it and building it, opens up opportunities for them. Specifically, what we've seen is that within the communities we've worked, there is a real appetite to support councils to do more and go faster on climate change and decarbonisation and adaptation, to the extent that citizens are happy to lend money at a cost-effective rate for councils, but go beyond that and actually donate some of their interest back to councils to further help them deliver their net zero plans. So I'll talk a little bit about the figures on that further down the sort of the presentation. From the council's perspective, by issuing these sort of investments and with the use of funds being specified, so for councils, for instance, West Berkshire, when they issued their investment, they stipulated that it is for solar on certain council buildings, it was for cycleway building and improvement, it was for some flood defence work, and they raised £1 million for that sort of group of projects. It was useful because for the council, because it helped them communicate what they're doing, and sort of, I suppose, give a sense to their citizens that they were actually taking action. And then on the other side of it, one of the bits of feedback we had from some of the climate activist groups in the community is that that transparency around project delivery that the investment provided was really useful for holding the council in a sense to account and building trust that the council was delivering the agenda. So when a council raises the money, they will stipulate the project, but then obviously they've got to update the investors on a sort of 6-monthly basis about how the money was deployed, and that starts to sort of build that confidence that the council is really starting to deliver things, and for the community also to put forward ideas. So one of the things that was really interesting out of the West Berkshire example is members of the community putting forward other buildings that they thought solar could be used on after they'd seen the council successfully deliver solar on certain of their existing buildings. So it starts to just open up the conversation and get more people involved in that plan. To date we've worked with the 6 councils on this list. We're due to go live with Westminster City Council in about 2 to 3 weeks, and then other councils that are sort of moving through the government process and have gone into the public realm with their intent to do this. In terms of large councils, it's Glasgow City Council and Bristol City Council, but then the model works very well for district councils as well. So obviously we've got on the list Telford here in Cotswold, and we've got, well, it's not a district, it's a small Welsh council that are looking to launch one to fund a wind turbine soon over the course of this year. So we move on. So I think in a way I've talked about this. What we see is the benefits for the council, and on the other side, I suppose, the community. It's this broadening out the ability to talk about and engage people with the delivery of net zero. I think there are some other benefits beyond the points I've talked about already, that with so many technologies required to hit net zero, I think one of the things I'm really interested in is that take heat pumps, for example. There's a huge amount of skepticism still about whether they work or not. So if we're going to sort of overcome that skepticism, people need to see that those technologies are being deployed. I suppose many of us on this meeting can probably remember the sort of early days of solar and the amount of skepticism that existed. Solar has the advantage that it's very visible when it's been installed, but that sort of growing sort of awareness that people were installing it and it was working helped accelerate the adoption rates. Things like heat pumps, actually they're harder to see that they've been installed. So we need every opportunity to show that leaders within the community are deploying them. So if a council is delivering a heat pump program, funding it through a climate investment, such as the one we're describing, is just another tool. It's not the total solution for communication. It becomes just another tool for helping communicate. And you can see that being true for many different technologies that need to be deployed. And then, yes, talked about the donation and obviously the idea that you're keeping money local is the final point there. This is getting a little bit technical, so I'll skim through this, but for people from councils, this will be maybe a bit more meaningful to them. So councils borrow the first port of call from a thing called the Public Works Loan Board, which ultimately gets its money from the UK government issuing gilts, so debt onto the international capital markets. We have, on the investments to date, saved the councils quite a significant amount on the borrowing rate. Sort of on the day that we launch, it's been about 20 or 0.24%, but then because we pass money across over the raise period, and this is a symptom of the interest rates having been rising over the time that we were raising last year, with that sort of sudden interest rate jump, the actual saving on the day the money became the council's was a lot higher, nearly 0.5%. We're going into a world now where the next councils that we work with and raise, the interest rate environment is very, very different to the one when Telford, who were the last council to raise last year. And I think the savings we're looking at for the next issue are pretty significant, because there is a greater sort of margin to play with between what the council would traditionally borrow at and what sort of competing savings products for individuals offer. So this is a little bit about the donation. So to date, we've seen nearly 8% of the interest paid out being donated back to the council, which again becomes quite meaningful in terms of extra discount on the effective interest rate the council is paying. One of the things I'm sort of again sort of most interested in around this sort of idea of having people as lenders rather than institutions is what happens when we have another crisis at some point like the pandemic, because what we saw during the pandemic is people actually are highly motivated to help within their community. A lot of money was obviously donated to the NHS. Not a penny from what I understand was donated to councils, but yet councils are very much on the front line helping their communities in times of crisis, whether it's through adult social care, children's services. These sort of things were really stretched at the height of the pandemic, and people as lenders during that period, if they've got the ability to donate or sort of delay interest payments to help their community, I think are going to operate in a very different way. Well, they're going to be open to that when an institutional lender won't, because individuals, yes, they value the financial return, but they also value the sort of the well-being within their community and the resilience of their community. So I think that having, for councils who see this use of this concept strategically and over a period of years start to build up their community of lenders and start to have a greater level of their borrowing coming from citizens rather than the institutions, I think will find themselves in a more resilient position further down the line because of that fact that people are different to institutions. They obviously think in a very different way about what the value is of the investment, recognizing the social return as well as the financial return. So this is again slightly technical, but the next offer to go live is being aligned with the international green loan principles, and this means we're aligning what we do at the UK council level with what the UK government did when they issued their green gilt and their green national savings and investment product. So it doesn't really make a lot of difference at the end of the day for an individual who's lending, because the process that we do around describing what the money has been used for and reporting that money has been used in accordance with the loan documentation, that doesn't really change because it's the way we've always operated, but it just essentially provides councils with that, and I suppose individual, the investors to a certain extent, with that security that there is alignment between what they're doing and UK government and I suppose the international capital markets. So countries, large companies and other major cities around the world have issued investments linked to these green loans / green bond principles. Okay, I think that's it on that side. So thank you for listening. Are we, I suppose, doing questions at the end, Liz, on this side?
Again, I think we should, there's a couple of questions that are very specific to you. So I'm going to suggest we do those first. One was Nigel Roby. So Nigel, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? And then so we'll have 2 or 3 questions, then we'll go on to Will, and then we'll have sort of a overall Q&A if we've got time after that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Carl. My question was simply how the municipal local climate bonds relate to kind of community energy fundraising. So Wey Valley Solar, like nearly all of the community energy co-ops, is raising money from the local community at various rates, 4.5%, say. Does the municipal bond, the abundance approach, does that threaten it? Is it complementary? How do the two approaches sit together?
It's a good question. I don't think that it's not a threat. It's very different. It's sort of complementary. I think there are councils we're talking to, and I think this is sort of one of the the sort of benefits potentially is around the councils wanting to invest into community energy groups. So they, the council becomes effectively the bank providing capital to community energy group. In those situations, the council is saying, actually, what we could do is we could borrow money from citizens. Therefore, citizens are taking the council risk. They're not taking the risk of the community energy group. And then we as the council are happy to take the risk on the community energy group. So we will lend the money. So it becomes an indirect way for citizens to support a community energy group deliver its project, but not taking that risk. And then I think in terms of that, that competitive tension, we see we've always sort of seen what we do as quite different to the community energy. Community energy is about taking ownership of an asset, being part of it as a group of individuals, taking that risk to go forward, and that's very different to this, which is lending money to a council on a very different risk profile, on a very different sort of level of engagement. It's a very different sort of just proposition in general. The experience of being invested, the motivation for doing it is very different. So I think where we would categorize things is it's the sort of hands-off sort of, I want to feel like I'm doing something good, but I don't want to get my hands dirty and get into the sort of the detail of things. It's just a way to help without having to sort of essentially do the hard work of delivering projects. So yeah, it talks to a different psyche in a way.
Yeah,
does that help?
Then we've got a question from Maria, and then from Maria from our community enterprise, then Daniel Heary, then Phil Sandel. I think Daniel is going to segue into Will's presentation.
Hi, Carl, Maria, hello. I wondered, as you've been approaching local authorities, if the uptake or the interest has varied depending on the political persuasion of the council that you're talking to, and whether that some are more likely to engage than others.
It's a good question. Actually, it's been a full spread of councils that have taken it on. So the first council to launch was West Berkshire. They're a Conservative council, traditionally quite a Conservative council. And then we've had Liberal Democrat and we've had Labour. I think it is one of those things that actually, from a party political perspective, they can each sort of craft into their narrative. So, the Preston, for instance, who hopefully will be doing this at some point, talk about this as community wealth building. It's that agenda that they've really pioneered, and West Berkshire, it is they just thought it was an interesting and better way to raise money. So they didn't. I think it hasn't come up against any barriers with any political party, really.
Right, thank you. I've been doing so many things. The next person was it Daniel Heary?
Yeah, we've been doing some work with the local authority to raise about 1.5 million towards a net zero project, and UK Infrastructure Bank won't do anything less than 5 million. We're looking at some debt finance, which is around 10%, but this could be a really good solution. What sort of levels of bonds have you raised so far in terms of the overall value?
The most we've raised for an individual council to date has been a million in a single issue. But I think that's one of the that we're sort of conscious of last year. It was a really interesting, probably the most challenging time to be raising money from individuals into councils, because interest rates were accelerating over the course of the year. So the narrative in the press and everywhere is, interest rates rising, don't lock in your money at a savings rate today because it's going to be significantly higher next week. We are there's still volatility, but the range of volatility is much less, and we're in a probably, I think most commentators say, a fairly stable place for interest rates now. So, and if anything, they might drop over the coming year. So I think we'll expect to raise quite a lot more now than we did last year. So we're going to go out with 1 million for Westminster, but that, I think we could probably raise more. I think the other bit that we've been exploring and we're going to be doing with Westminster, and it's obviously quite a unique case, given it sort of the area in which it operates, is something that Camden Council did, which they did off their own back, and we're trying to sort of build on it. Is they went out to local businesses who have a CSR agenda and want to publicly be seen to be doing something good, and saying, actually, why don't you lend money to buy this bond and then commit to the donation of interest, and that becomes something we can talk about talk about your involvement, talk about what you're doing to help the community. And for lots of reasonably large businesses, they need to put money to work in sort of a treasury function. They need to earn a little bit of return, but they also have CSR departments where this is a relatively cheap way for them to, and a low risk way for them to do something positive. So that's something we're exploring with Westminster, because if a council can build a community of large employers, wealthy businesses that are going to lend to them and commit to donating a proportion of interest from the outset, that obviously has a huge benefit for the overall cost of capital and what they can then go on to achieve with that money.
Thank you, Carl. There are some other questions, but I think they will link into Will's presentation. So I'd like to hand over to Will Cottrell from Brighton Energy Co-op, who are in the process of launching a community bond. So can I hand over to you now, Will?
Yes, thank you, Liz.
And then we'll bring up the
right?
other question.
Great. Yeah, so I'm Will Cottrell. I'm chairman of Brighton Energy Co-op here in Brighton. And I better give a bit of a disclaimer here. We were hoping to have a bond launched for this presentation, for the time of this presentation, but unfortunately we've had some technical issues at the site, which was due to be funded by the bond, and so it is not launched at present. But we have gone through all the process of getting the bond together. We've done the internal scrutiny, the external scrutiny, and so it's kind of ready to go. It's all packaged up and ready to go. We're just waiting to solve the technical issues we have at the site itself. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about Brighton Energy Co-op, who we are, what we've done, then how we've funded what we've done to date, and why we think a bond is a decent idea, and then a kind of a look at how to do it, the sort of processes that we've gone through, and the things to think about in terms of the regulatory requirements of doing the bond. So as I said, Brighton Energy Co-op is 12 years old now. We built or been part of 91 solar projects here in Brighton. We have £3.5 million of assets and about 20,000 solar panels that we own and operate across maybe 50 buildings. We partner with our local authority, we partner with schools, factories, warehouses, local university, ports, churches, and we've got solar on all these buildings dotted around the place, all of which has been community funded locally. So we have 700 investor members. About 60% are from Brighton, and the rest are outside Brighton. And we've run to fund them to date. Oh, a bit more about the organisation. We turn over about, this year we'll turn over about £450,000, something like that. That's our revenue, and we'll have raised £400,000 this year through a share offer. There are 6 of us in the team here in Brighton, in the office, and of our membership, we've paid this year we'll pay about £150,000 of interest to our members. So I've got a presentation. Let's get that up. Okay, can you see that all right? Yeah, I seem to have lost audio, but I hope you can hear me. I'm not hearing anything these, but So yeah, as I said, we started we actually started thinking about a bond about 5 years ago, and we went through the process of developing the bond, and again it got put on hold, and then we decided to use a share offer instead. So our sort of fallback, if you like, or our original funding mechanism has been share offers, and we've run 10 or so of them.
Will, can I just interrupt? We can hear you, but you're quite quiet. So could you just talk louder?
Yeah, how's that? Is that
Oh,
better?
that's loads better.
It's I work on an old PC.
That's loads better. Thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, this is what I'm going to talk about, and then I'll get into some more boring stuff at the end, unfortunately, but appropriate if you're thinking about doing a bond yourself. This is us. So as I said, we've got 91 odd solar projects, electric charges. The green ones are ones we currently operate a European Union grant to give businesses match funding for their solar installations. What else have we got? We've got our community fund has given away solar systems to various local organizations, that kind of thing. Yeah. So yeah, we've done 10 share offers, nearly £4 million. Usually, well, all the share offers are more or less all the share offers are 5% interest, and the capital is repaid over 25 years. So one of the things we find is that actually very few people want to take their capital out. We'd rather they had the capital back, because then we don't have to pay interest on it. But our model allows us to pay back capital over 25 years. And most of it has been done in-house in terms of getting the money through the door. So there are obviously platforms like FX, Abundance, who are, well, platforms to raise money, and then they pass the money on to the people doing the projects. And community energy groups have certainly used both to fund their offers. We found, obviously there are fees associated with that, so we prefer to do it ourselves, and building up the mailing list was key to that, but we kind of continue to do that. So we got to August last year, and we were funding a system which via a share offer, which has now closed, to fund a local solar on a local wine estate. It's about 1,000 panels or something to 400 odd kilowatts, and really we were fundraising at the worst time. Really, it was Liz Truss. Everything had gone tits up. Everybody was suddenly in a panic about their mortgages. Energy prices were going through the roof, and people were saying to us, well, we don't want to put money into things anymore because we don't know what the hell's going on. So for the first time, really, we noticed it was more difficult for us to raise money. We've never had any problems raising money. It's one of those things that people always assume it's hard, but from our experience, 5% has always been enough to, and a project that delivers local action on climate change has always been enough of a incentive to bring the money through the door. And suddenly, August, September last year, things were all over the place, and our 10th share offer was going quite slowly. So we were wondering, all right, we've got this mailing list of 5,000 people. Have we kind of maxed it out? You know, in which case, what are we going to do? Because we need to get some more money. We've got this new project, which is about £1 million, something like that, and it's not looking like we're going to be able to do this with our share offer model. So we got thinking about what people do when they're investing money, and quite sensibly, people don't put all their eggs in one basket. So if somebody's got, I don't know, £10,000 that they may have inherited, maybe they'll put £3,000 in something and 3,000 in other things. You know, it kind of spreads the risk, which is perfectly rational So for the people that we talk to via our mailing list and our 700 membership, we found that actually they would be interested in investing more into Brighton Energy Co-op, but not in the same form. I.e., they don't want to buy more shares, because shares have certain characteristics. They're payable back over 25 years, and it's an investment product that they find that they think they've kind of had enough of, if you like. Our average investment is £3,000 to £5,000. So the bond was to develop a different investment product and to try and pitch that. So we're sort of talking to the same people. We're talking to this 5,000 mailing list, and I don't know, about 50 people a day on the website or something. And we were like, well, okay, we've got the share offer stuff, but how about this bond? So the bond is pitched at 6.5% for 5 years. So that's kind of where we came to as an organisation, and we thought, okay, well, yeah, we'll give it a go, see what happens. So as I said, it's not launched at the moment because we've got some technical issues, which, as anybody involved in community energy will know, these things take a long time to develop, and all sorts of things can happen along the way, and you never know if it's not going to happen at all. But what we did, we said to our mailing list, we've got this thing coming up at 6.5%, 5 years. Are you interested? Which is something that we always do before we run a share offer. We said to people, we've got this coming up, let us know, and we'll let you know, when we're ready to go. And the response was remarkable, really. I mean, we had 1.5 million pledged within a week from 300 people. And we only sent an email. There's a form on the website that people can fill in, but it was really only an email. And we're still getting pledges coming in 6 weeks later. That somehow or other the email seems to have gone viral or something, but people out there are sending it on to other people and they're pledging. So we feel that it is very attractive to the people out there, this bond, more so than the share offer. I mean, that might be something to do with the interest rate. The interest rate 6.5%, our share offer is 5%. So that's hard to gauge. But there certainly seems to be an appetite out there. I can't say that for sure because we're not launched yet. But yeah, it was in our 12-year experience, it's the best pledge response that we've had, this bond thing. And I think one of the things about shares in the community energy setup, at least, is that how you get your money out question is really unclear to most people. I mean, it's not clear to us, as we know what we're doing, but it's a hard question to answer because it's we pay back 4% of capital each year, so we have a pot, and when it reaches 4% of the value, then we can't pay any more capital back, which is quite a hard thing to simplify in terms of explaining, and I can see people what. But it's always been a bit of a difficult one for people to understand. I mean, they get there in the end. It's not really been a barrier to investment, but with a bond, it's much clearer as to how you get your money back. It's 5 years, that's it, you get your money back. And you don't have to go through this sort of explanation of a 25-year payback of the shares. So I think that really helps with a bond as well. It's kind of a clearer thing than a share investment. So the next bit, oh, sorry, I've lost control of my Zoom. Seems to have taken over. So the next bit is about how to do this. And one of the questions from our board when we discussed it a while back was, are we really allowed to do this? And they wanted a demonstration from me as to, as a community benefit society, which is what we are, can we just go ahead? There's certainly plenty of other community energy organisations have done a bond, and they're all community benefit societies, more or less. And I've given some sample bond documents to Liz to share with you from over the years, and they've funded solar systems, wind turbines, all sorts of things. And here in Brighton, if you've ever been to Brighton, one of the bus companies is called the Big Lemon, and they've got big yellow buses, and they drive around with invest in electric buses, 5% 5-year bond written on the back of the buses. So obviously the Big Lemon are able to fund buses with a bond. They're a community interest company. So it's not an uncommon way of funding stuff. It's less common than the shares, but it's not a particularly uncommon one, and that's been the case for about 5 or 6 years, I guess. And you didn't used to see bonds in the community energy sector, but I think as we've developed, bonds have become, perhaps because of this, organizations want to offer their membership different financial products rather than iterating the same thing, because that helps get money in through the door. So this is for community benefit societies and cooperatives, the sort of number one resource of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do is the Community Shares Handbook, which is written by Cooperatives UK, which is a cooperative facilitation body. And that gives you the details of the sort of best practice around operating and running a co-op. So in that, it says all societies are required, in terms of this is in terms of borrowing, which is what a bond is. In the borrowing section, it says all societies are required to state in their rules the terms on which they can borrow capital. These terms may include blah, 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 blah. So, okay, that's what it says. First of all, you have to say in your rules that you could do it. So this is our rules. So it says societies shall have the power to borrow the money for the purposes of the money, including blah, 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 up to 10 million. Okay, so that's pretty good. So our organizational rules say, we can do it. Great. And what else does it say? We can mortgage stuff, we can issue debentures, securities, other stuff, a bit more detail about borrowings there. Rate of interest, so it specifies the rate of interest. So these rules are signed off by the Financial Conduct Authority when you register when we registered our community benefit society. So they've had some degree of regulatory scrutiny. So rate of interest is C. And then the society may receive donations. And finally, this thing about deposits, and this is quite interesting. So the society shall not accept deposits. There can be a sort of tendency just to raise money and then say, okay, we'll get some projects further down the line. That, to me, sounds like a deposit. So I think what the FCA are doing here is saying, you can't just raise money and then hope to find a project a bit later on. They want to be a bit more specific than that, because you start to look more like a fund than a community energy organization if you're taking money through without on the fly, as if you were. So then we've got the Community Shares Handbook again. There are no legal restrictions on the terms and conditions of the loan arrangements a society enters into. Sounds pretty good. So pretty clear we could do this. It's treated as a commercial decision of the society. No amounts of no limits, maximums, minimums, and can be secured or not secured. So this is actually more free than a share offer. A share offer, for example, has legal limits on the investments that can be put into shares. So the maximum investment for a community energy organisation or community benefit society is £100,000. So with a bond, you can have more than that. But that doesn't mean, just because it says you can do it, doesn't mean you're exempt from other bits of Financial Conduct Authority scrutiny. Looks like I'm muted.
I just want to, I'm sorry, I did that accidentally. I was trying to unmute myself. I'm conscious that we've got 14 minutes left and we've got 2 or 3 really good questions. So I'd like to encourage you to speed through the misleading financial promotions if that's possible. Thanks.
Yeah. If you're going to do it, have a look at the Financial Conduct Authority misleading financial promotions, because there's a bunch of stuff in here that you should do. And most of it's about being clear about what you're doing and providing enough information. But these are good questions to ask yourself if you're developing a bond offer. And finally, this was really what the board wanted to know about. You know, when we were discussing this stuff, you know, what's the maturity? How are we? When are these things going to end? When are we going to have to pay them back? And how are we going to pay them back? So with 5-year bonds, we've got to work out. Okay, we'll have a good idea of what we're going to do in 5 years to give people their money back. And interest-wise, ensure that your documents say that the board have the rights to change and not pay your interest rates, because if you don't put that, you might be unable to change your interest rate, and then if something happens to your operation, then you may be in trouble. Transferability, can you sell it, buy and sell them? It's much easier to issue a bond and shares that aren't tradable, so only they can trade with, people can trade with us, but they can't trade it within themselves. And then capital repayment, the controls around this it's important to have organizational control of the money payback bit as well as the interest bit. So make sure that within the documents that you issue that it's specified that these things are at the discretion of the board of directors. They're not fixed in stone. And that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Will. That was very, very thorough and comprehensive. And I've just put your presentation in the chat so that people can go and take some of that information away. I want to hand over to Danny Lee, who's got a question, and then Andy Milstead. And Karim, I'm very aware of all of your questions, and I don't know if anybody, Andrew Karim, I'm very aware of your questions. I don't know that anyone has some solid answers for those.
Okay, thanks very much, Andrew. Yeah, my question, impressive financial position and return on investment, but I wonder if you just unpick that. Old feed-in tariff you must have benefited from, given that you're 12 years old. So if you didn't have that, what would be your situation today? Then the second part of my question is, for bond offers, are we perhaps suggesting that more mature organisation projects with established critical mass and a viable financial position are better placed to get the bonds going? If you're not in that position, perhaps you're not going to be as successful.
Yeah, that's good questions. So hang on, the older organization, I think it's your second question. Yes, I think yes, older organizations are better positioned to issue a bond, because you've already got a revenue stream and bondholders will take preference over shareholders. So if the organization is able to pay shareholders and then they issue a bond, that they would, if the two issues are the same size, they would be able to pay the bondholders without building a new project. Even that if it all went wrong, the bondholders are much better protected if there are existing shareholders, and obviously if there's no existing or it's a startup organization, then I think the issuing a bond would be, unless it's secured, you could work out a way to sort of guarantee bondholders' return against the asset itself, which we don't do, because you wouldn't be reliant on the shareholder revenue, if you like, or the shareholder bit of the cash. You would be reliant on the asset itself. So yeah. And what was the first one question?
Yeah, I was just your financial position is impressive, and I guess that's largely down to feed-in tariff. And I wondered, what would your situation be today if you didn't have the feed-in tariff, given that newbies don't have the advantages of having that?
I think we're about I think about 25% of our revenue is feed-in tariff, and the rest of it is electricity sales to sites and export. But you don't need you definitely don't need a feed-in tariff these days for solar projects anyway, providing that the site that the solar is going onto uses most of the electricity. It's been up and down because export rates in the last or electricity prices in the last we've got 6 months have been all over the shop, but they're definitely coming down again.
Yeah.
And so for a little bit, you could just build anything, and you get big export. But
okay,
these days, yeah, providing the site uses 60% plus electricity, then the thing should stack up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got a question from Andy Milstead and then one from Nick Owens. I think if you could each ask your questions, and then actually I'll ask Andy's. Andy's is, are the shares or bonds directly linked to the project, or is it funding Brighton Energy Group? And then Nick Owens had a question too, which looked like a nice quick one, which is, how do you repay 32.5% of capital at the end of 5 years?
So the first question, they're not linked to specific projects, so they're linked to us as an organization. It's just too hard to do it to specific projects, because we'd probably have to set up separate organizations for each project, and then you've got to appoint a board of directors to each organization. You've got to have board meeting, you've got to do accounts. I mean, organizations that have, like back in the day when you're doing big residential solar for free, most of the UK solar is 1 million solar roofs in the UK. Most of that was built in 2010, 2011 by people getting high feed-in tariffs, but they set up hundreds of SPV, special purpose vehicles, to fund these things and to own these things. And consequently, they have to have hundreds of board meetings and hundreds of accounts and hundreds and what. So, yeah, it's too hard to allocate shares and bonds to specific projects. So we do it as an organization as a whole, and I think that's most people do that. Most community energy people, anyway. 32.5%.
Just correct that, actually. It's wrong. Of course, it's 100% of capital after 5 years.
Yes.
And your 6.5% times 5 years. So, but I think you've already answered it, because you've got the existing cash flow from a huge bank of other projects.
We probably wouldn't refinance it using our existing revenue. We might fund it a bit, maybe 10 or 20% at year 5, but I think we'd look to refinance it at year 5, and that would either be people rolling over the bond. It automatically rolls over unless people specify otherwise, or going to a different, or issuing another bond to buy out this bond at year 5, or some other external funding source, which there's various people, like a loan or something. I think the preference is always community ownership. That's what we're set up to do, and it's just a lot easier doing community funding than spending 6 months filling in forms for some organization, which then asks you a bunch of dumbass questions, and you have to do a report every 3 months to fulfill their criteria. It's just to do community shares is a lot easier.
We've got a question from Laura, but I'm conscious we've only got 5 minutes, and there is another question from Mark Conrad in the chat that I'm hoping Carl Harder could answer while Laura asks her question.
Actually, I think it's been answered by what you previously said about the refinancing of the bond.
Okay, good, because I'm conscious that there are people we've overlooked. So, Carl, Mark Conrad, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, so it was really about drawing up what seems quite crucial difference between a community energy company running its own bond and the municipal bond route, and it's really, I'm putting it as a statement, but it's a question. The risk shedding off to the council seems hugely important. And that's the main difference between the municipal bond route and the issue your own bond route, which is more about tweaking your own capital structure, isn't it? Whereas if the council is doing the bond, they're in effect bearing the project risk. Is that true?
Yes, exactly. So I think one of the, and council sort of, I suppose, partners at the event will talk about this. It is a very difficult thing for a council to get comfortable with making an investment into a community energy group. So that route that I talked about of a council raise money from citizens to go to a community energy group, it's not something that every council across the country will do. It really comes down to the objective, strategy, risk appetite of that individual council. But there are examples, and I think they're really good examples of it being taken forward. I think Devon is very active in exploring this, and Plymouth have obviously done it as well. But yes, the risk return profile of each route is very different. So if you're lending money to a council for them to deliver projects, that could be investment in the community energy, the return is going to be less than the return that Will's talking about in terms of Brighton. But arguably the risk is less. No UK councils ever default on its debt. You're effectively taking UK government risk. In the context of a community energy group, there is a more complex set of risks there. So the return, if you're thinking about it purely from a market perspective, the return should be higher. Obviously, there's very different motivations for investing into Brighton Energy Co-op, and those override some of those risk reward trade-offs, because people know that they're supporting their community, deliver stuff and putting stuff into community hands, which is a massive motivator. One thing, Will, I was just thinking, in terms of that sort of attractiveness, when you issue a bond as a community energy group, that can be wrapped in an ISA, but the consideration there for you, as you're probably aware, is you need to then work with a platform. It's not something that we facilitate for community energy groups, but it is something I think FX do provide, is the ability to hold that bond in an ISA, which helps on the overall attractiveness.
Thank you. There's a final question that I'm just going to ask. We've got 2 minutes left. So there's a final question, which is, there are other questions that I'm really sorry we haven't asked, but they would be opening up totally new debates. But there's a final question, which is, have any share or bond issues similar to this failed?
I'm not aware of any. It's a bit of a movable feast. You kind of set your target up, and then if you don't reach your target, you extend the deadline and sort of see what happens. And then even if that doesn't work, you could go to FX, and FX, as Carl says, they do a lot of this stuff. They've got a huge mailing list, and if they won't take you on, then your financial model probably isn't up to scratch. But you could try and do it yourself, fail, then you could go to a platform. I think there's several routes you could take to make sure it doesn't fail. I'm not aware of any that have failed personally, no.
Thank you, Will. I just want to thank everybody for coming along and participating, and I want to apologise to those people who didn't get to answer their questions. There's another question from Nick Owens. I'll ask you to respond to that in the chat, Will, if that's possible. But yeah, I'm really sorry. There are some questions, in particular Andrew Karim, lots of questions about the bigger picture, and Siobhan Maguire as well. You asked a question about getting the money from the wealthier areas to the poorer areas, and I'm sorry we didn't attend to that question, but I would have liked to, but we've only got 90 minutes. So I just want to thank all of our speakers. There are more questions.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It's been a great morning, and my only final comments are to say, let's try and keep in touch with each other, and give a plug for Community Energy England, who have a page of all the different kinds of funds for available. If you're not already a member, join. If your organisation doesn't have a turnover or an individual, it's free to join, and there's practitioner forums that are set up on there so people can carry on talking to each other and asking questions of people that are doing this. already. It's a great way to learn from people. And yeah, and thank you very much everyone for attending, and thank you very much for the speakers. It's been an excellent morning.